We are now into our final plenary session of day one, and our last speakers today are Allan and Rachel English from Australia, and it seems quite appropriate that our last speakers should be Australian, because Australians often come last when they're in New Zealand. Actually, on a kinder note, can I just acknowledge very quickly before we have a riot, I think there are 18 Australians who have made the trek across the Tasman. They may be these ones in the yellow sort of hue here, some of them. They could be. So that's quite a good mob. I think that's what you call yourselves, isn't it? Mob over there. So a very warm welcome. Kia ora, haere mai, g'day. It's lovely to have you here, and it genuinely is here. Lovely to have you here so that we can make fun of Australians. Back to our speakers. Allan and Rachel English are both from the English Family Foundation, and their presentation today is going to be facilitated by Philanthropy New Zealand CEO Tony Payne. So Tony, can I invite you to come forward and guide us through this final session for today?
Folks, it's indeed a great pleasure to add to John's unkind words of welcome, and I think quite risky words of welcome given the result in the league the other day. John, I don't think we should be talking too much about who's winning and losing with Australia, but folks, it's a real pleasure to introduce Allan and Rachel English. You'll see from their surnames that they are indeed related, and so our thoughts turn now to family philanthropy and to private philanthropy, and we intend to have a conversation with each other about the issues that raise. The format is the same as some of our other plenary sessions, so if you do have questions and have your Smart Gizmo app, feel free to send them through and they'll come through to me on the stage, and I will be able to pass them on to Allan and Rachel, and so that will be a good part of this conversation. But as a way of warming you up to that, we're going to ask both Allan and Rachel to say a few words about innovation and what they're seeing in their philanthropic work around the world. As when Allan and Rachel came up to the stage before, I said, we haven't talked about who's going first, and Rachel quickly said, "You are, Dad," and Allan said, "Yes, of course." So, which I think goes to prove a number of things, including that Allan's an absolute gentleman. So, folks, it's a real pleasure to start by welcoming Allan, who's the founder and executive chair of the ASX-listed and B Corp accredited Silver Chef Limited, founded in '86. And then in 2000, as a volunteer, he established the Queensland Office of Opportunity International. As John said, created the English Family Foundation in 2010, and supporting local and overseas social entrepreneurs to tackle some of the more challenging issues facing our society, and goodness knows we've got plenty of those. Allan serves as a council member of Philanthropy Australia and is on the advisory board of QUT's Centre for Philanthropy and Not-for-Profit Studies. He was a former recipient of the Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year Award, and was recognised in 2012 by the Queensland Communities Foundation as Philanthropist of the Year, and in 2014 he won the inaugural Philanthropy Australia's Philanthropy Leader Award. So Allan, with that very impressive CV and track record, it was a delight to ask you to take the stage.
Good afternoon. Okay, today's the session is about innovation, and I thought I'd just cover off in a couple of quick areas. Number one is the need for innovation, the influences of innovation, and what's philanthropy and how they're going to adapt to this new future that we're facing. One of the things that we're all very clear about in today's society is the advancement of technology and how that's influencing our lives at a rapid rate of knots, and the change that's happening is really quite a rapid hockey stick moving up that graph. Yet if we have a look at societal change, society itself moves much slower. So, 10 years ago, interracial marriage was accepted. Today we've got, New Zealand's well ahead of the game with same-sex marriage 4 or 5 years ago. Australia's still adapting to it, haven't quite got their heads around it yet. Society changes at a slower pace. So that means that we're actually in this moment now of uncertainty where technology is advancing faster than society is adapting. So what does that mean for us? And it obviously brings about a lot of uncertainty. There's the aspect about robotics coming into play, which is really going to take away some of those lower skilled jobs that are around, which many of our community members are affected by that and potentially will be affected. So I think that we're going to be in for some significant changes. So who are the influences that are going to bring about change? One of the influences, of course, is government. You know, the government plays an important part in the community sector. But let's just stop for a second and think about government. You know, the current tax rate in Australia is 30%. I understand New Zealand's 28%. Governments around the world, though, are moving towards a lower tax state. So we're talking about the UK is currently 20% with pressure to bring it down to 18%. Hong Kong runs at 16.5%. The USA is dropping to 15%, so Mr. Trump tells us. So these global pressures about lowering taxation means that for countries to continually to hold and attract new employers are going to have to start matching market rates. So that means there's going to be less income coming into the community sector. So more than ever now, we need to be in that space of innovation. So from government, in capitalism itself, there's two influences of capitalism. One is production, the economic creation of wealth, the jobs of business, the factories that produce wealth. The second influence is government itself, who sets the rules of capitalism. These are the rules the game will be played by. This is why you get government lobbyists trying to change government rules to get exemptions to influence the game of capitalism. So we need to be able to get government to stepping into the space to be changing the rules to allow for innovation to take place. Some of those things we're looking like in Australia, of course, is in the policy space. You know, we're looking at the moment, the government in Australia this week, announced that they're spending $30 million to start propping up the social impact investing space, starting getting some traction going there. I've been part of a team lobbying senators in Canberra for changes to enable B corporations, to enable business to start stepping more into a leadership role, because when it comes to that resource pool, you know, it's very narrow. We know that corporate philanthropy, while growing, is still a very small amount. All right? We know that our private foundations are growing, but once again, we're a small amount. Charity fatigue is affecting people. When you walk down the shopping mall, everybody's rattling a tin in front of their face. You know, they feel that they're giving enough. So it's only by the creation of innovation and social entrepreneurship and social business are we really going to start seeing them bringing some of that resources and skills into our community sector to start filling some of these gaps. B corporations are an interesting movement. Silverchef is a benefit corporation. What B Corps do is, rather than corporations standing just purely for the shareholder, and that's what the current laws are, we say that there's more stakeholders in running a great business. You've also got to be able to take into account your staff when you're making your decision-making processes. Environmental sustainability, that you're going to have good corporate governance and act in a truthful manner, that you're also going to be involved in your community. And the process of going through a B corporation is you've got to be accredited by a third party to validate that you say what you do. So it's a really tough gig to get. But most importantly, there's 2,100 companies around the world in 50 countries that are all part of this tribe who want to use business as a force for good. Now, we need to be able to have governments to start changing legislation that enables these corporations to be protected, because one of the risks we have is we can set up and change and be a purpose-driven organisation, but you're very vulnerable. In a takeover environment, the private equity guys come in and say, well, the first thing we'll do is stop doing all that community shit, we'll get that straight to the bottom line. All right, so you can wipe out a lot of the good work that gets done. So we need to have legislation about to protect companies that are doing these sorts of things. Social procurement's another thing the government can be doing more effectively. Start outsourcing some of the funds that they're spending in the for-profit sector to social enterprises and social procurement to be able to encourage the sector to go forward. So what about for the philanthropy sector itself? I mean, obviously, our ability to adapt in this new environment, it means doing more for less. So we've got to find new ways to be able to innovate our way of thinking and backing those social entrepreneurs and those innovators in our societies that are going to be doing more. We need to collaborate more. We need to share and understand each other's skills and strengths, because we're not like in the for-profit world where everybody's a competitor. One of the beautiful things about this sector is there's no competitors. We're all in the business together. So we've got to collaborate and share. And by that, sharing also means we minimise some of our costs. We don't get into cost duplication of doing multiple levels of research on the same project. More collaboration will build more efficiencies into our business with a greater degree of transparency. Most importantly is about prototyping and testing. We've got to have an acceptance that failure is part of innovation. We've got to be prepared to fail more regularly and faster so that we can test new ideas and be prepared to understand that failure is going to be part of the formula. And we need to be educating our trustees that to innovate and to be a leader in the sector, we've got to have an acceptance of failure as part of our secret ingredients. I think that we've got many challenges ahead of us, but that doesn't mean that we don't have the ability to influence and bring about and be with these changes and work hard to achieve the goals we all set forward for ourselves. Thanks.
Thank you, Allan. We'll look forward to unpacking some of those ideas with you in conversation. It's an equal pleasure to introduce Rachel, who after gaining an economics degree has spent time working in the not-for-profit sector, starting at the Foundation for Young Australians before Rachel moved to the UK to work for Virgin Unite, the foundation of the Virgin Group and the Branson family, and now works with the Frederick Mulder Foundation. While completing the final stages of psychology degree, she's also on the advisory board of the youth arm of the Funding Network, as well as a trustee of the English Family Foundation. So, Rachel, welcome to the stage.
I realise now that I completely blew it by asking my father to come before me, because now I have to follow that. But hi, thank you for having me. I was resistant to have my input in this introductory section revolve around young people in philanthropy, because I like to think that I have more things to add value in this sector than just being a person in my 20s. But if I really sit with it, I honestly do think that what's been missing in a lot of our conversations and where all this innovation will come and continue is through this new generation of people getting involved in philanthropy and who are energised to change the conversation. And whilst I could talk about impact investing in bonds and business, my father is obviously much better versed at doing that than me, and I'm sure Tony also is great. So happily, if not momentarily reluctant, I want to talk to you about this new generation of philanthropy who are using connections and employment and technology and community to work together, and how none of these segments of life exist in silos anymore, which is what I believe will continue to fuel innovation in philanthropy. There's a start of this cultural shift towards philanthropy, making it more accessible and something that happens alongside everyday lives. As Katie mentioned this morning, there are now networks that have made philanthropy and giving more of a social exercise, like a giving circle, and like the Funding Network, which exists here in New Zealand, as well as in 12 different countries. There's great leverage that can come from funding with other people and in a group, but there's also this level of social connection and the community that you find when you find yourself in this together and working towards a common goal, which I think is becoming more and more important for this young group of people that are coming into the space. Having it be a social event to give back is an important shift away from this tall poppy syndrome that our two nations unfortunately seem to share. An old employer at the Funding Network, Fred Mulder, he once said that giving is one of the few things that we do alone. We eat together, we work together, we dance together, and I've discovered that giving with others is more interesting, more satisfying, and probably more effective, and it seems to go further. And part of this story of innovation and collaboration is the fact that we are this globalised society now. We have organisations spanning across the world, and we're able to see what's happening on the other side of the world, the good and the bad, and often it's the bad. And so it's no wonder that young people today are getting more invested in social change than generations that have come before us, and also why they're getting more disengaged with traditional politics as well. So on this global connectivity level, there's great initiatives that bring the world together, like Divest Invest, which is a pledge that people across the world have made to divest out of fossil fuels. We were one of the first signatories in Australia, but now it's reached 720 organisations across 76 countries. 159 of those organizations are philanthropic, and there's a combined asset of 5.5 trillion US dollars that has been committed to getting out of fossil fuels. And just this week, there's been 9 Catholic institutions that have signed on. So it's a movement that's gaining momentum. And I think we're seeing more of that coming through. Another example is the Nexus Youth Summits, which is taking this concept of giving together to the next level. It's a global network of under 40-year-old philanthropists. It's what we deem as young in this industry, which is why I'm very happy to work in here. I've got many years left in me. But it's a network of philanthropists and social entrepreneurs and impact investors all working together to create change. The driving force behind it is that by 2061, it's estimated that there'll be 59 trillion US dollars transferred down from your generation to my own, and that's in the US alone. It's scary stuff, considering that 70% of wealth transfers fail at in one way or another, and Nexus exists with the belief that these young people who will be our future leaders and future givers who are receiving this wealth can create change faster than any government can. And if we can make that change good, then that will be putting us in very good stead for the future. And the fact that there's this network of social entrepreneurs that are coming in and choosing that as a career path, as Dad mentioned, that's innovation in itself. It's this, again, with getting out of having these silos of doing good over here and making money over there. It's all happening collectively, and that's what's going to drive this movement moving forward. And collaboration with these social entrepreneurs, impact investors, our non-profit granting partners is key to, to creating value and delivering as a foundation. And what feeds part of this collaborative approach is the ability to harness technology, as Allan said, to reach more people. For example, we've partnered with crowdfunding websites to put up social ventures, and we've covered the first chunk of funds because that seemed to be the most difficult thing to fundraise. And so trying to find new ways to reach small grassroots organisations that are out there that might not have access to a room of people like this is what we're going to have to keep iterating at and getting better at if we want to start to see change and kind of elevate the cause a bit more. So all of these shifts in culture and understanding of philanthropy feeds into so much more, which is what we will discuss for the rest of the session. But ultimately, what I want to say is that we're creating an environment where philanthropy looks and is very different for this new generation coming into the sector. And for those who act philanthropically, who don't even realise that they're philanthropists, we need to find a way to sort of support that movement a bit as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Allan, I wonder if we can start with you and just unpack a bit more some of your comments about the role of business and the relationship of business to the community. It seems to me that that's a shifting and moving phenomenon, and perhaps it's something of an identity crisis for business as they think about what their relationship to the community is, and clearly we've gone beyond, we're just here to sell stuff to the community. How do you see that evolving, and how do you see us creating a coalition of more businesses willing to engage in the kind of, I guess, community making that you've been talking about?
Yes, I think it's an encouraging move, shall we say. I think there's more and more I'm being asked to go and talk to businesses asking to, how do we get purpose built into the DNA of our business and what does that look like? And we've had the movement of the corporate social responsibility, the CSR movement, and there's one thing that about staff engagement is vital if you're really going to be able to be a great business and build it well. And the Gen Y sector particularly is very, very much aligned to wanting to have purpose in their work. They want to have a career, they want to make good money, and they want to change the world. If you can create an environment where all three can be active in it, then you'll win their hearts and mind, and they'll give you their very best. But when they get to the CSR stuff for the larger corporate companies, there's another thing about Gen Y, is they've got the highest refined bullshit detector of all time. They can pick a poster on a bill and know that it's not true, because they've been marketed to all their lives. They had McDonald's in front of them on a TV ad when they were 5 years old, So, therefore, it's got to be authentic and it's got to be true. So, but if you can create those environments which are directly linked to that purpose piece, then you get some fabulous talent. And there's so much work out there, like you get paid for 38 hours a week. The engagement levels for people run between 25 and 26 hours a week on an average corporate entity. Fully engaged people who are there with a purposeful bent about why they're at it in the organisation, their engagement rates are in that 34 to 35 hours. So that's almost a 25% difference in engagement, which of course makes a company far more productive and obviously wealthier.
Speaking of Generation X, Y, Z, or the various names we've attached to people younger than ourselves.
I believe I'm a millennial.
You're a millennial? Thank you
yes.
for
My
self-identifying
apologies.
there. I didn't want to put my foot in it, but I guess it does raise the question of the points you were making about the next generation of philanthropy. Can you start by just putting that in the context of family philanthropy? Because I think that's interesting, particularly perhaps to the family philanthropists in the room. That, how has that been in your family? Has that been...
Getting involved?
Getting involved, yeah.
I was mildly reluctant, again, getting involved in the foundation because there's a lot that comes with being the kid of a philanthropist and, you know, forging your own path and just being that rich white kid that thinks that they can solve the world. But it's great working in the foundation with Dad. I sit as a trustee, as does he, and my mother. And we work together really well. In saying that, I did run away to the UK for 2 years so I could work in philanthropy over there and not be associated with the family. So I suppose I had to go through my growing pains as well. But it meant that I've been able to come back to our foundation with different ideas about how we should be doing things. While I was over there was when I suggested that our foundation sign on for Divest Invest because my employer over there was one of the first European signatories. And also was where we discovered B Corps because I was working at Virgin Unite, which is the Branson Families Foundation and the foundation of the Virgin Group, and they have what's called the B Team, which I suppose is not dissimilar to philanthropic foundations and then Philanthropy New Zealand. They sort of sit as the industry leaders. So they've got Richard and Ariana Huffington and Murray Ibrahim and lots of very big Paul Polman business leaders that are starting to create that conversation around what to do with, like, how to make business a tool for good. So experiences that I have outside of our foundation end up feeding into the foundation anyway, and now I work in philanthropic services. There's no getting away from it, so it's really nice to be able to kind of be over here and be this involved in the family business, which is kind of what it is for me. The Silver Chef is a publicly listed company. I wasn't getting involved in that business. And our foundation is just a nicer family business to get into.
And I mean, it occurs to me that, I mean, I've heard a number of people say that as I've been introduced to philanthropy, that one of the issues with philanthropy is that the aspirations of one generation, as the world changes, your desire to change the world and your theory of change, as it were, that can quickly be left behind as the world changes, and you get those sort of perverse things where a foundation's been set up to do something that no longer makes much sense. Are you starting to think about the direction of the English Family Foundation? Is the baton being passed so that you're thinking about the world and what might work in the future?
You've all heard or met my father. He's a fairly innovative man and is fairly good at taking on new ideas and trying to be at the forefront of how we deal with philanthropy. And our foundation only set up in 2010. So each year we sit down and talk about our strategy and what we want, you know, what the pressing needs are in the community and whether we want, you know, whether we're on the right track with where we're going. So I haven't found that, like, I haven't wanted to kick Dad out of the seat just yet. I think he's still got a few good innings left in him and I have a lot to learn, and so I think it's so far so good.
Pleased about that.
Yeah. Now, folks, I just need to check. Are people sending through questions? Because if you are, I'm not getting them. So can we just, has anyone been sending through questions on Show Gizmo?
Geez, you can tell it's almost 5 p.m, hey?
You don't, I'm not, if you don't, it's not working. Okay. John, can I ask you to maybe just go and check about whether we can do something about that? I don't want this just to be a conversation between three people if there are people in the audience who are wanting to make use of our guests and our time. So I think what I might do is we can ask perhaps the VidCom people to come and help us get a microphone around the room, and we might take some questions from the floor in the old-fashioned way. We'll move from Jen from the millennials back to the people who remember the world before.
Yeah, we have our flaws.
Before apps and things like that, you know. Folks, are there some people who'd like to have some questions from the floor? Yes, sir. Let's wait for the microphone so that we can all hear what's going on.
Allan, I think it was you who asked the question this morning of the gentleman about how you deal with shareholders who are saying, give us all the money, it's not for you to go giving our money away. And I've heard that being called corporate theft and what have you. But I thought the response from the Countdown man was very good, saying, well, that is our company philosophy, it's out there. If you want to be with us, come with us and enjoy the benefits of it. If you don't want to be, well, go and buy something else. How did you feel about his response to that?
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, it's a good question. I did have that conversation the second day after listing on the stock exchange, where my second largest shareholder came and looked me in the eye and said, Allan, you're a nice lad and I appreciate the beliefs that you've got, but I give you my capital, give me the best possible return. What actually happened is that I overcome that problem by transferring our own family shares to set up the foundation, which had nothing to do with the other shareholders, and then was able to demonstrate the value that we are able to create for the shareholders in meaningful terms. And when you're talking to shareholders, if you're talking about doing good in the world and you're wanting to change the world in a nice way, it doesn't sort of resonate with them, right? You're talking a different language. So I had to recraft the conversation in dollar terms to make it real for them. And how I was able to do that was because, Silver Chef is now getting its own foundation. We're doing more and more giving apart from the English Family Foundation. And so that shift needed to have some educational component to the shareholders with it. So what I said was, we listed on the stock exchange in 2011 at a market cap of, 2005 for a market cap of 11 million. By 2010, we'd got to 32 million market capitalisation, which means the shareholders had a nice little bit of growth. But in 2010, I then set up and changed the purpose of the organisation by making the foundation the largest shareholder, did a whole values workshop for all the staff, created a vision about where we wanted to be and fund 1 million people out of poverty by 2020, the whole purpose piece, and then found that we were attracting wonderful talent coming into the organisation. In 7 years, we've grown from 32 million to 320 million, which is a multiplier of 10, all right, in 7 years, which is really quite extraordinary growth. And what I'm saying to the shareholders, that's being created because we've been able to attract wonderful, talented people who want to be associated with companies with purpose. And we can demonstrate the value of what we create in the world. So we're getting shareholders starting to say, well, actually, this value shit seems to sound all right, because they're making a lot of money out of it. But we can be a case study for other corporates to be able to say, just because you're aligned with purpose and creating social good in the world doesn't mean it has to be a sacrifice to shareholders. You can do both. Business can be used as a force for good for shareholders and community.
Thank you. Any more questions from the floor? I have actually got a couple here, but let's stick with these ones. I wonder, Allan, you mentioned your desire. In fact, you both said in your bios your desire to use philanthropy to tackle some of the big problems that we're facing, and you mentioned poverty, for example, an intractable problem that charity's been dealing with for millennia. And a question from Matthew, which reflects this: can you give us some examples of some of the innovative philanthropic activities that you funded and supported that go to some of those wicked problems, some of the big and complex problems that we're facing in societies like Australia and New Zealand, where poverty remains this intractable and blight on what is an otherwise prosperous countries?
One of our main granting partners is Opportunity International, which is a microfinance organisation, and that's sort of has been how we sort of ended up having a foundation. And what has driven the foundation was lifting this 1 million people out of poverty, which has now been increased to 1.5 million people out of poverty, because because of the success of Silver Chef, we've been able to fund a bit more. And so with that work, it's looking at microfinance, looking at the multiplier effect that we can have from our granting, and trying to be quite strategic and big picture about it is one example. I suppose. But that's obviously not within Australia, so.
No, but the poverty levels of the developing world was a primary driver for us to get into philanthropy in the first place. And microfinance is a way of giving women in the developing countries a start, and you get 2 generations of change. You're not only having a transformational effect on the mother, who's now becoming a primary income earner for the family, but the first thing they do is that when you ask them a couple of years down the track, how's it gone, what's changed for you? The first thing I always say is, I've now got 2 children at school, So the kids are now, so you're getting 2 generations of change for $200, and thus seeing the mother being transformed, their own self-belief in themselves gets transformed, and then that loan gets repaid in 6 months and gets lent to another woman. That same transformation goes on again. With a 98% repayment rate, the money goes on for 50 years. So, we're at 920,000 so far towards our goal of the 1.5. So it's extraordinary impact that you can create. So certainly in poverty alleviation in the developing world has been about 30% of our grant-making space goes into that area.
That immediately raises the question of how you assess impact, and those are impressive statistics, how you collect those. What do we mean by someone being lifted from poverty? How long does it take? How long do they need to be out of poverty to tick the box? How have you gone about, particularly I think as you're grant making at some distance internationally, how have you gone about knowing you're making a positive difference?
Well, certainly having the right partner is very important, particularly in the developing world space. And we've got the modelling and the impact assessment stuff has been refined and developed and got better and better and better. And the surveys that go in them where they actually measure the household and what is currently in the house, and have they got electricity, do they have refrigeration, do they have cooking equipment, all those sorts of measurement criteria are along the way. So no, I'm extremely comfortable that we've got the measurement criteria right, no problems about that.
We went out to India in November of last year to meet with our granting partners on the ground and to really understand the work that they were doing, because they have an Australian base, which is great, but of course going out and meeting the people, feeling the issues is something that's quite important to us. And what they have, they've got community workers that go out into all the various slums that they're servicing with iPads, and when they go in there to collect their loans back, they're taking surveys and they're taking data every day in every interaction that they have. And so it's become quite a robust set of data for us to feed back, which is helpful.
So once again, that it's about the philanthropy only being as good as the people that we're supporting and investing in, and relying on them to have their processes and theories of change and ways of assessing the evidence.
Absolutely.
So there's a due diligence that goes on in philanthropy, which is much like investing in any company, isn't it? So you become adept at doing that due diligence, I guess. Has that been something you've been quite conscious and deliberate about developing methodologies?
We've got no hope unless we've got good granting partners. Like, what are we going to do? We're sitting in Brisbane and Melbourne. Like, unless we're, connecting with the right people that are on the ground actually doing the work, we don't have a place, And so we try really hard to find really good partners. And Belinda, who is she works in our foundation, is an absolute gun and spends all of her time just meeting people and talking about what the needs are actually on the ground. And we've been quite lucky to make some good partnerships, I think.
It's interesting to me that we can get good advice about which companies to buy shares in. It's much harder to get good advice about which charities are doing the real thing, and because it's much harder to define success, I think. So, look, a question from that's just disappeared, from Edward, for you, Rachel. Just thinking about once again the experience of young people in philanthropy. How did you find that in the UK? Is there an acceptance of the younger generation in philanthropy? Were young people starting to take their place around the governance of philanthropy, things like that? Or how was that over there?
I think so. I think philanthropy in the UK, it's just a more established sector. It's been going for longer. There's more generations of people that have been involved in the family. There's higher figures that they're working with than there are in Australia, and I would hazard a guess in New Zealand as well. And so I think there is more discussion around it, but also there's really, what I found really surprising about being in the UK was there's still quite a lot of class structures there. You could, from the accent that someone had, you knew where they were from and probably how much money they had, and I think that has created quite a socially aware society. There's a lot of people that like really care about social justice, and I think a lot of that comes from being very easily pigeonholed, which in Australia it's not as much the case. And so I think there's more activity across the board, and in traditional philanthropy and granting philanthropy in sort of in the high net worth individuals, I think it is a bit more second nature than it is definitely in Australia. There's not many, it's a very small percentage of the top percent that actually give a significant amount of their wealth away, and I think there's more, less so than in the States, but yeah.
Thank you. I was wondering, I've been thinking about the issue of accountability in family philanthropy, because you have a huge amount of freedom. You can choose the causes that you're interested in. You can choose, as you've just said, you can choose who you might want to share your grant making with and which causes. How do you see to whom do you feel accountable in that process, and how do you see that accountability playing out? You're accountable to Dad?
Yeah.
We don't believe that. That's quite
I suppose we're accountable to the people in the communities that we're trying to serve. If we cock up with one of our grants and something bad happens, then, you know, it's like I was reflecting last night that there was one of the earlier grants that we made was around Indigenous young people and bring them out of their communities and putting them in white boarding schools. And we were like, yeah, this is great. We've done an awesome thing. These kids are getting a fantastic education. And then as we got a bit more savvy in the space and actually stopped and were able to reflect, we're like, that probably wasn't the best way to go about doing that. And I think unless you're quite careful and quite rigorous around what you're doing, and again, have conversations with people in the communities that you're trying to serve, you can quite easily be disruptive rather than be beneficial.
I would think also that the transparency, I use the Silver Chef staff has been a barometer for me, so we'll do, because at the end of the day it's the creation of the wealth that comes from the company that goes directly to the foundation as its largest shareholder, so therefore the staff are engaged and understand what we do, and so we do a dashboard update on the various sectors and what we're funding and that sort of stuff, and I take staff to the field. So we had four staff come to India with us. I was in Alice Springs last week, and we had 3 staff with us in Alice Springs, having a look at the work that we're doing there. So I try and involve them, and I sort of see them as being my stakeholders in the process.
Yeah. No, that seems really good. Look, I've got a number of questions that have come through from folk who are, I think, keen to hear a bit more about your work in Australia. So just to give us a flavour of your domestic philanthropy and where your focuses lie, I think people would appreciate it.
Sure. So 40% of our work is abroad, Southeast Asia and India. Domestically in Australia, 40% of our funding goes to support social entrepreneurship and the growth of social entrepreneurs. And that can look like direct funding into an organisation if it has the correct tax status, but a lot of work with intermediaries and a lot of work around the infrastructure that supports the growth of social entrepreneurship. And 20% of our budget is in a family allocation, which is sort of set aside for passion projects, for anything that the family is interested in, whether that's the Women's Justice Network is the last one that our family did, or whether it's a homeless organisation. It doesn't have to be to do with social entrepreneurship, it's just a way to engage the family and keep us sort of aware of why we're, ultimately we want to have the family be together and all be involved in our granting, and that's a way to make it relevant for anyone if they're not as entrepreneurial as Allan might be.
Allan, I think a question for you, a couple of questions also about, can we hear a bit more about B Corps and how that's working, and is that, you may not know the answer to this, but is that something that's alive and well in New Zealand, or is it?
Yes, the B Corp movement is still relatively new in Australia, so this is just its 3rd year. In New Zealand, there is, I think, 7 or 8 companies in New Zealand that have gone through the accreditation process. It's quite a rigorous process to go through to get accredited, but the encouraging thing is that it's an online process, so really any business can log on to the B Corp website and begin the accreditation. It's a process of being able to look at how you're going so far. What are the things that you could be doing to become a better company and a better citizen in the community. And some of them are really quite simple things, like when I did going through the assessment process, I came to the employment practices and where we're at, and it said, so how many people with disability do you hire? I went, shit, how did I miss that? And I don't know. I was embarrassed to say I didn't employ anybody with a disability. And yet it was such an obvious thing, I'd missed it, and you get points for employing people with disabilities, There's a number, it's just a way of continually making you aware of how you could be better. What are your environmental sustainability processes that you're currently going through, corporate governance. There's a whole range of different things, and it's a continual improvement process. So while you might not get credited as a B Corp and finally get that big tick, it's a roadmap for continuous improvement. And it's measurable, it gives you measurements about how you're going as a business compared to others in the community, etc. So it's just a stepping stone to continually improving your processes as a business and get aligned to that business as a force for good.
It's been a good way for you to engage your staff as well, because I've got with your B Corp hubs at each of the offices.
Yeah, so we've got offices in New Zealand and Canada, and at every office there's a B Corp committee, so they're all involved in the process as well. So it's very inclusive. Yeah.
Folks, we are fast and sadly fast coming to the end of this conversation, but I wonder if we can just turn now to the question of should philanthropy have a point of view, and if so, what can it be? How loudly can we speak truth to power? How much advocacy can we do for the causes we care about? How political can philanthropy become? And I'd be interested in both of your views on that issue.
We can't be very political with how we grant. There's a lot of restrictions in Australia about who we can and can't grant to, and when you start to get too political, the government starts to not like that very much, which is obviously shocking. But I think there's certainly a need for a shift in that, and I think philanthropy needs to be a voice to the government for what changes we need to make. And we can't be the only voice. We need to have the community there with us, but being able to leverage the power that someone like Dad has to be able to start that conversation. I think there's ways to do it directly with the government rather than supporting a political organisation, I think. But it needs to happen more.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree with Rachel on that. And it is a sensitive market at the moment. I mean, there's a number of environmental causes in Australia which the government have wielded out the big stick and says, you're doing advocacy and we're going to take your registration away to receive donations. And that's, a very difficult thing, because the reality is that part of the problems that and all of us, I'm sure, in the foundation space, is the sandpit that we're playing in is just cleaning up all the rubbish because of bad policy, largely, and yet we can't be seen to be out there advocating for better policy and engagement. Yet I think we really should be, I mean, if we're going to bring about the changes that we need to see in society, we can't just be in the space of cleaning up the mess. We've got to be on the front foot to start bringing about the changes that are needed. And when we're seeing really clear change in policy-making issues that should be addressed, don't just accept it and say, gee, that's a shame. Wouldn't it be great if something like that changed? Get engaged. Start talking to people about bringing pressure on politicians to change some of the dumbass policies that are out there,
So you seem to be saying it's more about the how we do it rather than the need to do it.
Most definitely there's a need to do it. It's about how we do it, I think is the issue.
Yeah. I was very struck with one of the global networks of organisations like Philanthropy New Zealand Wings, who at the end of their last forum produced quite a hard-hitting communique which talked about the erosion of civil space and the need for philanthropy to stand strong in the face of some of the sort of the violent political zeitgeist we're seeing around the world at the moment. And I'm just, that seems like an interesting position, and it would, given that philanthropy is a very broad church, I think we have to be careful of not getting people left out about that, but it does seem an important part of, if we're interested in social change, that's part of the equation, isn't it?
Yeah, I mentioned the Nexus Youth Summits earlier, and that's, this global network, and the entire premise of it is that people can move faster than governments can, and perhaps it's something around leading by example, and if you create these innovative approaches, and I think that's where philanthropy plays a big role, is taking the risky steps to prove something, to make it be so and get some rungs on the ladder so that the government can go, oh yeah, maybe. And so perhaps that's the role that we can play, like in that initial setup, and prove something that's doable, and then handball it to the government to see if they can run with it.
Well, folks, I think I'm just looking at the time, and I appreciate that for all of us it's been a long day, and I think we will draw this conversation to a close. Can I offer on your behalf very sincere thanks to Rachel and Allan, not just for sharing some of your insights in the world of Philanthropy, it's also exposing the English family to a certain amount of intrusion into how your lives work. So, folks, can we give our guests a round of applause? Thank you. And I will hand back to, should we hand back to Ronald to pass on our thanks to Allan and Rachel.
Kia ora, Allan, and Rachel for your wonderful kōrero, and I'm just going to close with another one of my ancestral sayings. Hāpai tia te ara tika, pūmau ai te rangatiratanga mō ngā uri whakatupu. Foster the pathway of knowledge to strength, independence, and for growth for future generations. Tēnā koe.
Kia ora.